So I'm curious how Rotten Tomatoes ranks the Terminator franchise, because we know a lot of those Rotten Tomatoes critics, they're just kind of weird about certain genres. So let's see how they rank them, and let's see if I agree with it. All right, everybody, just a reminder, when at least 60% of the reviews for a movie are positive, you see a red tomato, which indicates that that movie is fresh. When less than 60% of the reviews for a movie are positive, you'll see a green splat, which indicates that that movie has a rotten status. And just also a reminder, this ranking will be sorted by the lowest tomato meter score to the highest tomato meter score. Also, next to each ranking on the left, I'll put where I rank that movie right next to it. So, all right, how the hell does Rotten Tomatoes rank the Terminator franchise? Well, coming in last place at number 6 is going to be Terminator Genisys from 2015, coming in with a 26% tomato meter score and a 52% audience score. The critics' consensus for this movie goes, mired in its muddled mythology, Terminator Genisys is a lurching retread that lacks the thematic depth, conceptual intelligence, or visual thrills that launched this once mighty franchise. I think this movie definitely has some visual thrills. Like visually, there's a lot of things in this movie that are crazy and all over the place, and pretty entertaining just visually as far as that goes. But yeah, thematic depth, this movie definitely lacks a lot of that, which we'll talk a lot about. But you know what we like to do with movies that come in last place? I like to go ahead and read a few critic reviews really fast. So the first critic, they said Terminator Genisys was fresh. They gave it a B-. That's not too bad, right? I'd take a B- in school. And they said, but hey, this summer, and we don't need thinky movies, right? So let's drive right through those plot holes and keep going without looking back. And yeah, I would say if you like this movie, it's one of those things it's one of those movies you can kind of turn your brain off. And if that's your thing, then you're probably going to like a lot of things in this movie. So let's do 2 more really fast. A lot of the reviews for this movie clearly were rotten. So we're going to read 2 more rotten reviews here. So the first critic said this movie was rotten, and they said, of course, the special effects are more impressive than ever, but nearly every curveball offered up in this new parallel universe version of the Terminator world isn't as interesting or as original as the timeline we loved in the first place. Yes, definitely. A lot of the new ideas that they approach within this movie are not that creative or interesting. They don't draw you in like the original. All right, and the next critic came in and said this movie was rotten, and they said it's as if it has gone back in time to murder our memories of the ancestral first film and crush the series' reputation. I mean, if you're a longtime fan of the franchise, it's not going to crush the reputation of the franchise. But if you're new to the franchise, maybe this was your first movie you ever saw, Terminator Genisys, you're not going to think that highly of this franchise. You're going to say, okay, it's kind of just like a generic robot movie without anything really that interesting going on, which is sad. So yeah, it kind of does murder some of the memories, but not altogether if you've been a fan for a long time. So yeah, Terminator Genisys in last place, right, guys? So this movie is essentially like a reboot that ignores the sequels, and it's got some stuff in it that are definitely like shot-for-shot copies of some of the original 2 movies, which definitely throws me off. The first time I watched this movie, I was like, oh, okay, we're doing that, huh? I'm very lenient, and I'm nice to remakes. I love remakes overall, but some of the stuff in this movie is, it's just not that great. It's just worse than the original and the original 2 movies, but it does take some new turns. I mean, John Connor, basically in this movie, big character in the franchise, right, guys? But he ends up basically being revealed as a bad guy as Kyle's going back in time. This movie is almost, in a weird way, kind of like the Friday the 13th movie from 2009, how it kind of pulls stuff from a few movies earlier on in the franchise, which is not a bad idea by any means, but just the way they pull it off is just not great. You also get some T2 stuff in this movie with the T1000 they implement in this as well. And also Kyle arrives in the past and things have kind of changed a little bit. It's a little slightly different than the original movie. Basically, things have been altered a little bit by Skynet, and Sarah has now been raised by this reprogrammed Terminator that was sent back to protect her, but just ends up raising her. And right away, the intro to this movie looks good. There's some solid action going on, but immediately I'm kind of thinking, oh, that's John Connor, the guy that they casted to play John Connor, and also the guy that they casted to play Kyle. I'm immediately just kind of like, ugh, all right. let's see how this goes, but I'm not really loving this so far. Also, very early on, I'm kind of like, man, I don't really like John Connor in this movie all that much. He seems way too pretentious. There's moments in the movie where he's just singing his own praises. He's like, oh, you pissants, you peasants, you guys wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for me. And it's like, if you want to make a character likable, have somebody else sing their praises for them and them kind of like seem a little bit, almost shy about it in a way. That would make you like them a little bit more. And I get how later on in the movie that kind of, I guess, makes sense. But to me, like when you have a John Connor character, I mean, a lot of you, I'm sure, feel the same way. You want to have somebody who's just like a badass, a dude's dude who's just wrecking shit and is somebody who's just so charismatic and somebody who's very likable, not this arrogant leader. Plus, on top of that, we're already taking a huge step down in the casting. I mean, we're going to this guy from Christian fucking Bale, who played John Connor earlier in the franchise. Like, come on now. So, and yeah, we also get Khaleesi in this movie, Emilia Clarke playing Sarah Connor. And I think she does a very good job. She's very charismatic. She's obviously a great actress. She's somebody who's a badass, somebody who I think is very likable. Unfortunately, I think her performance in this movie definitely gets overshadowed by a lot of the plot holes and just messiness of this movie. But she's great in this, I think. We also get this guy named Jai Courtney playing Kyle Reese in this one. I've never seen him before in other things. I don't think I've ever seen him even since this movie in other things. I don't know. Maybe you guys have, or maybe I just don't recognize him in a way. But in this movie, I mean, he's fine, I guess. He's okay. He's pretty forgettable. I mean, he is just nowhere near the level of like a Michael Biehn from the original movie, though. And that's not just me having nostalgia for the original movie. Michael Biehn has proven himself as just being a massive actor in both the 80s and the 90s. A very underrated actor now that we look back. But yeah, Michael Biehn is just great. I mean, he was in movies like Tombstone, Terminator, Aliens, The Rock, The Abyss. I mean, come on now. Let's put some love on Michael Bihn's name. So in comparison to the Kyle Reese in this movie, I mean, there is no comparison. Plus, I'm just not a big fan of the way that they wrote Kyle in this movie. They made him out to be like this pessimistic guy who seems very green in combat situations, whereas Kyle in the original movie was one of the coolest action stars in the entire decade of the 80s. I mean, this guy in this movie, Khaleesi would never fuck this guy. But probably my biggest gripe with this movie is it feels like they're turning the Terminator franchise into just like a corny superhero type of a movie with this particular movie. If I was directing a Terminator franchise, that is never the route that I would go with a Terminator movie. To me, this franchise is at its best, and I think most people would agree, when the Terminator movies are gritty. It's this unforgiving, almost like this dystopian world, a Blade Runner type of a feel in a little bit of a way with that type of aesthetic, with some scary robots. In this movie, though, it just feels like I said, like a corny superhero movie. Now, is Terminator Genisys a terrible movie? No, I wouldn't say that, but to me, it's not a good Terminator movie at all. It's actually pretty sad to think that we went from the original two movies to this. But yeah, do I agree with Rotten Tomatoes having Terminator Genisys last in the franchise? I actually disagree. I have Terminator Genisys number 5 in the franchise because there are some things to like here. I think the movie that I do have in last place is a lot worse than this movie. So yeah, I do have some fun with this movie, but I would put it at number 5, second to last place in the franchise. All right, up next at number 5 is going to be Terminator Salvation from 2009, coming in with a 33% tomato meter score and a 53% audience score. The critics' consensus for this movie goes with storytelling as robotic as the film's iconic villains. Terminator Salvation offers plenty of great effects, but lacks the heart of the original films. Well, this movie actually does have heart in it, literally. Later on in the movie, there's some heart aspect of that, which we'll talk about. But yeah, I mean, I would agree with some of that. The storytelling in this movie, the script, and some of the things are very robotic, a little bit generic, but it does, I agree, have great effects. There's a lot of flash to this movie. The casting in this movie is great. I'm actually a sucker for this movie. I like it a lot in some ways, but there's also some things that I do not like about this movie as well, which we'll talk all about. So this is actually the biggest budget in the entire franchise, not by a lot, but it is the biggest budget in the franchise. This movie is a sequel to Terminator 3 and kind of also a bit of a reboot in a way when it came out. It's also the only movie in the franchise not to have like a full-blown, like real Arnold in the movie. They did it digitally for the scenes that Arnold was in it, which, you know, fortunately they only did that a little bit, but they actually used, which was cool, they used a mold that they had of Arnold from 1984 to make the digital version of Arnold in this movie. So I respect that. I thought that was a cool idea. And yeah, I'm sure Arnold probably would have came back for this movie if he wasn't busy, you know, with the whole governor thing going on in pre-production for this movie, the Governator. But this movie, basically, we're following the characters in this post-Judgment Day environment, in this post-apocalyptic world. And yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of that concept. I like that grittiness, that like kind of unforgiving environment where they're just trying to survive against the robots. I just think that's a great idea. So on the surface level, just going into watching this movie, that concept, I'm like, hell yeah, let's do this. And yeah, this movie right off the bat hooks me right in. I already find myself interested in trying to find out like what's going on with Sam Worthington's story. Not just because he's an incredible actor who I think in some ways is a little bit underrated, even though he's doing massive things, obviously, in the Avatar franchise. But he's this death row inmate who we go through this process. We're watching him kind of sign away his body for medical research. So obviously he's done something terrible, but there's also like something inside of him. He seems like, okay, was he like convicted wrongly or what happened? There seems like there's more to his story. Plus also on top of that, we get like a fun ass action scene following John Connor on this mission, which I mean, come on, it's Christian Bale playing a grown-up version of John Connor. Could it get any better than that? I mean, this is around the whole Dark Knight era of Christian Bale. You could argue like the peak of Christian Bale's powers, the peak of his fame in a lot of ways. But yeah, Christian Bale is just great in this movie. Unfortunately, the script for Christian Bale's character and the script for a lot of other characters could be a lot better. I mean, the script in this movie, some of the dialogue and everything like that is just very corny, in my opinion, and is definitely one of the biggest holes in this movie and is pretty distracting at times. I also love it in the franchise when they go with this idea of both the humans and the robots have weaknesses and they have to kind of try to exploit those weaknesses. And this movie does that. I love watching Kyle kind of try to outwit these things and try to figure out which weakness each of the different types of robots have. I think that's great. And in one of the scenes where we see that is we get that insane action moment scene at the gas station. They're taking down these small robots, these big robots. We got a dogfight between jets up in the air. You know, we got Christian Bale like jumping with an axe onto this transport vehicle. I mean, it is like, especially in a movie theater setting, it is some crazy adrenaline action. And yeah, as you could probably guess, I love the casting in this movie overall. I think overall it's just great who they casted for the different characters. But I will say, once supermodels start ejecting out of airplanes and shit like that, it's kind of like, all right, guys, love me some supermodels, but, you know, maybe let's relax a little bit. And also the whole Arnold CGI thing, I mean, that's definitely an L for this movie, in my opinion. I also mentioned this in the Alien Romulus review. Can we just relax on this deepfake stuff or whatever it's called until the technology is right? I know this movie came out way before Alien Romulus, but still, I just don't think the technology is there. Can we just chill on it a little bit? Come on, please, guys. Also, at the end of the movie, I do think the whole the heart transplant moment and stuff, it's a little bit cheesy. You know, it just is, but I get it. I mean, it's kind of like the whole nail in the coffin, like his mission to kind of get a second chance on life, kind of redeem himself by Sam Worthington's character giving up his heart for Christian Bale's character. I get that. You know, kind of a cool moment, I guess, a little bit, but a little bit corny as well. And I remember when this movie came out in theaters, I went and saw it, and overall, it's a fun ass movie with a lot of potential to be an all-time classic Terminator movie. But to me, the mediocre script and kind of the generic plot directions that they go with the movie definitely held it back a bit, without a doubt. I mean, imagine if this movie with this cast, with the Terminator IP that they're using, was directed by somebody like a Christopher Nolan or something like that. Damn, that would be crazy, right? But in the end, do I agree with Rotten Tomatoes having Terminator Salvation at number 5 in the franchise? I actually disagree. I have Terminator Salvation number 3 in the franchise because to me, this great cast, this post-apocalyptic world, characters that I want to follow, some fun action. Yeah, despite kind of like the bad script and things like that I mentioned, I still have a lot of fun with this movie, especially, like I said, because of the cast. So yeah, I would have it number 3 in the franchise for me. Okay, up next, we've got a tie in the number 4 and the number 3 spot. We've got Terminator Dark Fate from 2019, tied with Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines from 2003. Let's talk about Dark Fate first, which came in fresh with a 70% tomato meter score and an 82% audience score. Damn, that's kind of crazy. So yeah, Dark Fate, the critics' consensus goes, Terminator Dark Fate represents a significant upgrade over its immediate predecessors, even if it lacks the thrilling firepower of the franchise's best installments. Yeah, it definitely lacks the thrilling firepower of the best movies in the franchise. Without question, does this movie represent a significant upgrade over its predecessors? To me, no, I would disagree with that. There's a lot of things to hate in this movie, which we'll talk all about. So this movie is a direct sequel to the OG from 1984 and Terminator 2. And in the beginning, in that scene in Guatemala, they bring back Arnold digitally, which looks crazy good. I'm sitting there like, who the hell made this? And why aren't they working on more projects? Because this actually looks legit. And the intro is also kind of a holy shit moment in a lot of ways. I mean, immediately I feel like I'm being thrown back into the world of T2. We've got Sarah, we've got John here, but then all of a sudden John just gets smoked. But also I'm a little bit confused. I'm like, wait, what's going on here? Did they really just kill him? A character we've invested so much into in both T1 and T2 just kind of disappears like that? Almost feels as dirty as what they did to Newton Hicks in Alien 3, but yeah, a moment where I'm kind of like, okay, this is a little bit weird. Yeah, we do get Linda Hamilton back, which is great, but still an introduction where I'm kind of like, oh, he's just gonna go out like that. Oh yeah, and on top of that, all that stuff that you did to try to prevent Skynet, oh yeah, well, we needed to make another movie, so yeah, technically it worked, but another company called Legion just went ahead and made their own version of like this AI built for cyber warfare. Yeah, sorry about that, but thanks for the effort, though. And yeah, the action and stuff like that is pulled off technically very well in this movie, but to me, it's kind of like, man, we're 6 movies into the franchise at this point. Like, these fights against these liquid metal Terminators just aren't interesting to me anymore at all. Especially because this particular Terminator, we don't hate near as much as Robert Patrick's Terminator. It's just not doing it for me. But we do get some great, like, beautiful shots of the landscape in Mexico. Also that moment where the Terminator is just carving and chopping his way through the border patrol in that particular moment when Grace and Danny are trying to escape. I appreciate the gore in that scene. I mean, it's a lot of fun, and it also just like shows you how unforgiving these things would be. All right, guys, now hold on tight. There's a big surprise coming. So who's in Texas? Whoa, big surprise. So yeah, basically in this movie, Arnold's been kind of like hanging out with his family, hanging out with humans for 20 plus years, kind of learning how to be human. Like, I get it though. Arnold was learning how to be a little bit more human in T2. He was kind of evolving, picking up things and whatnot, but still it's kind of a little bit corny. I do like that moment though, where like a random major in the Air Force just shows up, who apparently, I guess, Sarah knows, and just goes, here you go. Here's an EMP you can use for fun times. I don't know. What are you going to do with it? I don't really care. But how do they know each other? What's going on here? Where did you come from, dude? How'd you get this EMP? What is happening right now? There's also this scene where we get the Terminator dialogue where he's talking about the right kind of drapes for a kid's room. It's like, dude, wow, we have gone in a totally different direction than anything James Cameron would have imagined. What has happened? And out of all of the movies in this franchise, this movie in particular feels like it has such a bloated budget in a lot of ways. It feels like the studio just cut them a blank check and was like, hey, go ahead, do whatever the fuck you want. You want to film like this full, massive, drawn out, big ass fight on this military jet with like 1 million digital effects? Sure, pal. I mean, this is pre-pandemic. The economy's booming. We are just printing money, baby. But yeah, the ending near this like hydroelectric plant, that's kind of a cool setting. I mean, that's a little bit fun, but this movie overall, it's just one of those movies where it's like the story and the overall concept of the movie is just not that unique. It's very generic. They're kind of just hoping like, all right, we're just going to throw like 100 explosions and massive action sequences in your face, just hoping that you'll essentially like black out and then walk out of the theater like, whoa, what is happening? I guess I was entertained. All right. But still, shout out to the effects team in this movie because the digital effects, all that stuff, I mean, it looks incredible. It really does in this movie. And overall, I mean, this movie, I guess, is an okay way to spend 2 hours of your time, I guess. But it's one of those movies you walk out of the theater, you stop watching it at home, and you'll forget about the movie in an hour. I mean, it's basically just 2 hours, like I said, of like explosions and fighting these robots who can't even be hurt by bullets. So it's like, why are we just shooting them with bullets? I get it. It slows them down, but still, it's just not interesting to me at all. It's like fighting something that you almost can't even kill. It just seems like a giant waste of time. Also, I mean, clearly to me, it was a mistake to give this movie this massive blank check, gigantic budget. Like I said, it's not the biggest budget in the franchise, but it feels very bloated for the story that they were going with. I feel like they could have just been more efficient with the budget. But yeah, it was a bad idea because this movie wasn't profitable. It didn't do very well in comparison to the budget. But do I agree with Rotten Tomatoes having this movie number 4, number 3 in the franchise? No, I disagree. I have this movie last in the franchise because to me, it's just the least interesting, worst casted, just most generic movie in the Terminator franchise. So yeah, there you go. Rotten Tomatoes has Terminator Dark Fate tied at number 4, number 3 in the franchise. All right, so yeah, like I said, tied with Dark Fate is Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines from 2003, coming in with a 70% tomato meter score, but a 46% audience score, the lowest in the entire franchise, according to the audience. But the critics' consensus for T3 goes, although T3 never reaches the heights of the second movie, it is a welcome addition to the Terminator franchise. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fun to be had here. I mean, 2003 is a fun time for action movies, for just movies in general, some nostalgia there for me. But yeah, overall, there's some fun things to like in this movie. But they do take some weird kind of storyline choices, and there's definitely some holes in this movie without a doubt. It is not perfect by any means, but there's still some fun to be had here. So yeah, this movie essentially takes place 10 years after they destroyed the stuff at Cyberdyne Systems, that whole thing that went down in T2. John Connor now, you know, he's a little bit older, of course. He's kind of this guy who's just basically like living off the grid. He's kind of like a drifter in a way because we find out that Sarah died. She died of leukemia, and when her and John were living in Baja. So they add in that whole story because it's like, okay, I guess Linda Hamilton didn't decide to come back for the movie. And yeah, I mean, of course, T2 was just so massively popular and successful. So they're going to pull a lot of things from T2 and implement it in this movie, especially because it's a sequel. And in this movie, they implement this whole like TX model, but it's a female this time. Feels very similar to the T1000 in some ways, but like I said, it's a female. It actually has like a species vibe to it if you've seen that movie, but it's this female and she kind of like uses her sexuality to get her way in certain scenes. Like there's that moment where the cop pulls her over and she sees like the Victoria's Secret billboard and then she like inflates her boobs a little bit to get what she wants. But yeah, that's pretty funny. But she's like this advanced liquid metal robot. Her arm can do all kinds of crazy things. It can like shoot out kind of like an EMP grenade or something that does crazy stuff to robots just in general. At one point in the movie, she's driving a crane while she's also operating like 4 or 5 whatever cop cars just with her mind, just with her computer system, which is kind of crazy. Speaking of the crane, that is a crazy chase scene, which I swear goes on forever. I mean, how long is that scene? It's crazy. And it feels like they destroy like half of LA in that entire sequence. It made me go and look up the budget because I was like, holy hell, how much money did they spend on this movie? And they spent like about 170 million on this movie, which yeah, of course is a lot of money, especially for 2003. But I was like, okay, that makes sense. I mean, clearly they spent a lot of money on that whole like chase sequence, which was pretty crazy. And yeah, like I kind of already mentioned earlier, this movie in a lot of ways feels very much like T2, which makes sense. It feels like a big blockbuster movie you could take your family to, go with your dad or whoever's into action movies and stuff. But I mean, this movie also has a kind of a lot of gore in it, surprisingly, which I respect. Like I said earlier, it kind of shows that like unforgivingness of these Terminators. They don't give a shit about your emotions or whatever. They're just going to kill you however they need to. Like that moment when the Terminator's in the back of the cop car and she shoves her hand through the cop. I mean, that lingers for a little bit. It's a pretty gory, brutal scene, and I respect that. So ultimately, James Cameron decided not to come back for this movie. It sounded like he was thinking about it, and there's moments in the movie without question you can notice the kind of slight lack of attention to detail. Of course, this is not a Cameron movie. It's not on that level by any means, but there's moments where you're like, oh, come on, guys. Like, really? We're going to go like that? Like that moment when Arnold is carrying the coffin with John in it. It's like the bulletproof coffin with all the guns and ammo and all that kind of stuff in it. And then, they go into the hearse and then John, they're still taking fire from all over the place from the cops. And then John just like gets out of the coffin, is just having a conversation about the future with Arnold while bullets are still flying like crazy. It's like, guys, maybe we should save this conversation for another time. There's also that moment which, clearly seems like just a weird, storyline choice, something that doesn't really make a lot of sense when the Terminator, approaches the girl in the movie and is running towards her. Like one of her goals or objectives is to kill this girl that's going to be John Connor's wife and one of the biggest people in the Resistance. And then she just reveals herself instead of staying in the form of her fiance way too early. Obviously, she should have just ran up to her as the fiance, gave her a hug, and then kind of just be like, gotcha, bitch, and kill her then. That part just didn't make any sense to me at all. And it's just one of those moments, like I mentioned, a director like James Cameron just probably wouldn't have flaws like that in his movie because he's so crazy about the details and is so thorough with everything. Yes, Cameron's movies are not perfect. I mean, they clearly have issues here and there, but still just moments where you're like, that's not great. So at the end of T3, I mean, I don't hate the end of the movie, but in a lot of ways, it's pretty anticlimactic. It's this story about no matter what you were trying to do in T1 or T2 or in this movie, Judgment Day was basically inevitable. It was going to happen regardless. And your real mission is to survive Judgment Day, and then it's your chance to fight back, which, I guess is an okay ending. But like I said, it's just kind of anticlimactic in some ways. But yeah, I mean, T3 overall is a pretty fun movie. It's one of those movies, if you're into action movies, you're going to enjoy a lot of the action in this movie because there's plenty of that. And the T3 is not, in my opinion, it's not a classic or anything like that. Like I already mentioned earlier, you can definitely see that Cameron is gone. You can see that this movie's just missing that kind of extra attention to detail, that grit, that kind of uniqueness. There's not enough added that's unique in this movie compared to the franchise, in my opinion. But, this movie still, I think it's a pretty easy watch and definitely, one of those popcorn movies you can just sit down and have a good time with. It's not that intense in a lot of ways. So yeah, do I agree with Rotten Tomatoes having T3 at kind of that 3-4 spot in the franchise? I actually agree. I actually have Terminator 3 at number 4 in the franchise. So there you go, guys. Rotten Tomatoes putting T3 tied with Terminator Dark Fate. All right, moving into the top 2. Here's where things really start to get interesting. Coming in at number 2 is going to be Terminator 2 Judgment Day from 1991. That's a lot of twos. Coming in certified fresh at 91% in the tomato meter score and a 95% audience score. The critics' consensus for T2 goes, T2 features thrilling action sequences and eye-popping visual effects, but what takes this sci-fi action landmark to the next level is the depth of the human and cyborg characters. And yeah, with all the movies we already talked about, that's something that's missing with those movies and something that Cameron brings to the table. Because on its concept, this whole Terminator idea is something we've seen before, But what makes, especially what Cameron did so unique is the depth to the characters and how he makes you think, okay, it's just a robot, but holy shit, there's way more to it than that. Yeah, okay, it's just a guy who's going to save the world, right? But there's way more to it than that. So yeah, as most of you already know, in T2, we're following this Terminator, the shape-shifting prototype Terminator sent back in time by Skynet to basically kill the leader of the human resistance as he's a child, John Connor, of course, and to protect Connor, the resistance sent back this like reprogrammed T-800, right? Arnold. And yeah, there is no doubt that T2 is the most mainstream successful movie in this franchise. If you were around in the 90s, you know what I'm talking about. There's probably some of you watching this video who weren't even born in the 90s, so I'll explain it to you. First of all, you're young as hell. Second of all, it was just crazy how T2 was just embedded in like the pop culture zeitgeist of society. Like every kid was saying the one-liners from T2. It was just everywhere in the 90s. And personally, I love this whole like bleak opening to T2 and just reminds you kind of what's on the line here, right? Billions of people dead. And now they basically essentially failed to kill Sarah. So now they're going to come back in time to try to kill her son, John, you know, when he's a kid. But right away, you kind of get an idea of how different this movie is going to be from T1. That whole scene where Arnold is at the bar, he kicks the biker's ass, Bad to the Bone plays. You're like, okay, this is going to have a very different feel than T1. This is going to be way more of a blockbuster type of a movie that can appeal to more of like the general public. I mean, even just the one-liners throughout this movie. Of course, you've got like hasta la vista, baby. I mean, what kid wasn't saying these things in the 90s, right? And that moment when Arnold grabs the sunglasses from the guy and it's like, holy shit, like Arnold's cool factor, just as an actor, as a person, as a character in this franchise, his cool factor just went up to a totally different level. Of course, we get all those scenes and shots of him like on the motorcycle and stuff too. And it's just badass. And people were eating this up in the 90s. And yeah, of course, we meet John Connor at this age, this version of John Connor in this storyline played by Edward Furlong. And I love how it just feels so 90s, especially his character, not only the hair, but just the portrayal of his character. I feel like in the 90s, we saw so many of these kids who were kind of like the bad kid in a way, kind of like pushed off by society, didn't really fit in, but also you could tell were very brilliant. And with John's character, that kind of hints at who his character will be in the future, his intelligence, his craftiness, is this ability to overcome obstacles. So yeah, in the first movie, Sarah was very much just a normal person, a waitress, but in this movie, definitely not. Like everything that she went through in the first movie, and then after that, she's now like basically been considered like a schizo. Even her son kind of views her as that. She's in this jail, hospital type of a setting. I also love the choice in this movie to make Arnold's Terminator version like a slightly older model. It adds this type of like vulnerability to every fight scene in this movie, which is definitely something I feel like a lot of the movies that were made after this are just lacking. Just that vulnerability, the stakes with the characters. They almost seem like they're completely unstoppable, which just makes the story not interesting at all. Whereas Arnold's character does have a bit of that vulnerability. He's kind of, like I said, like an older model, like something, you know, the Resistance probably would have. So they have to kind of outsmart this more advanced model, which I think is fun. Also, man, every time in T2, when we get a voiceover from Sarah Connor, I am buckled up. I'm invested in that scene. It feels so intense. It feels so real. Also, just this concept of like time travel and what happens when you kind of manipulate the past or the future and the ripple effects of that. I mean, that to me will never not be a storyline that I find interesting. I love that. And there are so many memorable, incredible scenes in T2. I mean, I couldn't even list them all. We could talk about them for hours in this video. But one in particular that I do want to talk about just a little bit is the end, kind of towards the end of the movie. Everything that goes down at Cyberdyne. I mean, we've got great action there. We've got helicopters, cops. They're trying to, of course, like destroy this thing, stop Skynet from starting, really. Everything that happens in that entire sequence towards the end of the movie at Cyberdyne is just incredible to me. Also, you know, a character that doesn't get enough credit in T2 is Joe Morton's character. Isn't Joe Morton like the perfect casting to play Miles Bennett Dyson in T2? Like this guy, this sweating, nervous, hyperventilating, like half dead guy in this movie. He's just incredible. I love it. What's also great about T2 is we get moments where it's like, okay, we just had this massive, crazy blockbuster fight sequence at Cyberdyne, but it's like, no, like the real battle hasn't even begun yet. In a lot of ways, I think like in comparison, T1 and T2 are kind of like Alien and Aliens in a way. T1, very gritty, more of a horror movie in some ways, whereas T2 and also Aliens, just more of a blockbuster. Of course, James Cameron directed both movies. Kind of interesting, just the comparison between those two. But I also love in T2, and it's so interesting to think about, it's another example of James Cameron just trying his best to like move the industry of movie making forward and just being a trendsetter. I mean, of course, in T2, like the trendsetter for like the latest digital effects with the shape-shifting Terminator they use in this movie, it was mind-blowing at the time. I mean, going back, some of us probably think, oh yeah, T2, that was probably made in the late 90s. No, early 90s with this technology. And even to today, some of the effects still hold up and look top-notch. Yes, there are some moments in this movie that don't look very good at all, but still it's kind of that weird time period where it's a bridge between going all practical and a lot more digital. And whether you like it or not, I always prefer more practical work, but still James Cameron, you gotta say something about him at least attempting to just push the industry forward, come up with new innovative ideas, and really just change the industry in a lot of ways. He's also doing that with Avatar in a lot of ways as well, but it's just crazy what they do in this movie with the technology and the time period it was in. It's wild. By the way, are cryo tankers a real thing? I don't think I've ever seen one in my entire life. Let me know down in the comments down below if you've ever seen a cryo tanker before, but still, to wrap things up a little bit, when I think about T2, this is like a blockbuster movie kind of for everyone. Whether you work on the docks or whether you're like an astrophysicist, it doesn't really try to push any agendas or anything like that. It doesn't try too hard to be like this elevated cinema or anything like that. Yes, the movie makes you think, and yes, the movie does have some depth to it, but mainly Cameron just wants you to have a hell of a good time, and yeah, T2 is a hell of a good time. So do I agree with Rotten Tomatoes having Terminator 2 in second place in the franchise? I guess that's the big question, and yeah, I actually do agree. I have Terminator 2 in second place, which is not a knock on Terminator 2. It is an all-time classic action movie. Incredible characters, of course, trend-setting with the effects, a great story. It's gritty enough. It's just a massive, fun blockbuster. So yeah, there you go. Rotten Tomatoes having T2 at second place in the franchise. All right, and of course, coming in at number 1 is going to be The Terminator from 1984, certified fresh with a 100% in the tomato meter score, which is crazy. I've never seen that before. And all the times I've done these videos like this, never seen that before. But an 89% audience score, still great, 89%. The critics' consensus for The Terminator goes like this: with its impressive action sequences, taut economic direction, and relentlessly fast pace, it's clear why The Terminator continues to be an influence on sci-fi and action flicks. And yeah, it's crazy. Damn near 40 years later, this movie is still inspiring movies that are coming out today. And yeah, this movie still also ages very well. And you know what we like to do with movies that come in first place? Read a couple critic reviews, which are obviously going to be fresh. The first critic said this movie was fresh. Much of Terminator's greatness is due to its low-budget aesthetic and lo-fi energy. Perhaps out of necessity, Cameron's sense of storytelling has a lean efficiency that both he and the series have long since abandoned. Yes, definitely. Like I mentioned earlier, so many of the movies in this franchise are just, the budgets are so bloated. And a lot of times just with movie making in general, that can hurt your movie because you cut corners, you do a lot of things that you should have done practical, digitally, and you just kind of get lazy in some ways. And there's just probably too big of a production, too many people on set, just too many things going on. And it just gets crazy. And yeah, with T1, I think this movie definitely, the leanness, the low budget aesthetic to this movie is just so great and makes the movie even more gritty. Let's go ahead and read one more. They obviously said it was fresh, and they said gritty, clever, breathlessly paced, and dynamic despite the dark shadow of doom cast over the story. This sci-fi thriller remains one of the defining American films of the 1980s. Definitely. This movie, without a doubt, has so many things in it that are clever. This wasn't a concept that was like that unique. I think there was a movie a couple years before this that was called The Exterminator that was kind of similar in some ways. But yeah, Cameron just made this movie just so gritty and clever and like paced so well, like they mentioned. Yes, definitely. I agree with that. And yeah, T1 is also so important because this is essentially the movie that launched James Cameron's career, one of the most successful directors in the history of movies. He did one movie before this, I think it was, Piranha 2, but before they gave him the Aliens gig, they wanted to see what he was going to do with Terminator 1, and because of the success, and just the great stuff he was able to pull off with T1 and how lean the budget was and how he was able to just stretch the budget and do, Productions love that. Can you stretch a budget and like make the movie cheap, but also make a movie that's really damn good? And yes, he did that with T1, which ultimately got him the gig for Aliens. So yeah, and if you don't know the story behind T1, very similar to some of the other movies in the franchise. I already talked about some kind of remakes and stuff like that, but it's basically like there's this cyborg that's sent back from 2029 to 1984 in Los Angeles. He's basically this assassin named the Terminator, disguised as a human, programmed to assassinate Sarah Connor. And then the Resistance sends back this guy named Kyle Reese to basically protect Sarah. And basically this concept, this idea for the Terminator came to James Cameron in this sort of like fever dream that he had during the release of his first movie that he ever had, Piranha 2. And I also just right off the bat love this idea of give us like a tiny peek into the war, what might happen in 2029 with the machines, this unforgiving world. Of course, they're using like these miniatures, which has a lot of charm to it to me. And I love just how they pulled that off with the lasers and everything like that. It just creates a story that I want to see more of. And yeah, right away, when you go back and watch this movie, you immediately see that, okay, this is going to be a very different tone, a very different feel than all of the other movies in the franchise. I mean, 6 minutes into the movie, Arnold basically just shoves his arm through this guy to steal his clothes. And you're like, all right, this is going to be a bloody, gritty adventure. But yeah, I just love the grit and the grime that this movie has. I also love this early to mid 80s portrayal of future technology that this movie has. I'm always a sucker for that. It's part of the reason I love the original Alien so much, but just this portrayal of what machines and future technology looks like is just awesome. And yeah, this movie benefits from being the first movie in the franchise because you don't know who Arnold is or this Kyle Reese guy is. They're just dropped into this place naked. He asks the cop, like, what year is it? You know, that whole scene, which is great as well. And right away, though, for me, I want to find out more about these characters. Like I mentioned earlier, Cameron just does such a great job taking these characters who seem basic on their face and just making them more interesting because we're watching Kyle and both the Terminator and Kyle, they just seem like such interesting characters because they seem crafty, smart, and resourceful. I mean, we get that whole scene where Kyle basically escapes like 10 cops, no problem, just using kind of his wits in this foreign place he doesn't really know anything about. He also escapes with like a handgun and a shotgun in the process. And you're like, all right, these characters are interesting to me. I want to follow them. I'm also invested in this Sarah Connor thing. I want to find out, okay, why are these two people going through so much effort, killing people, doing whatever they got to do to try to get to this Sarah Connor person? Of course, like I mentioned earlier, this movie benefits from being the first in the franchise, but that whole story is just interesting to me and I want to find out more. And yeah, I already talked about this guy a little bit earlier, but Michael Biehn as Kyle Reese, a character who's got to be one of my favorite characters in the entire decade of the 80s. I mean, Michael Biehn, a guy who could have been a bigger star in a lot of ways, but I've heard like didn't really want to play the Hollywood game in some ways, but still like went on to do some incredible things I already mentioned earlier with some of the movies he was in and stuff like that. But he's just one of those characters where you're like, damn, this guy, you know, he's not saying a lot in this movie, but he's somebody who just has a lot of screen presence, charisma. He's somebody you want to follow and you root for in this story. And to me, this is Linda Hamilton at her best in this franchise. Yes, she's great in T2, but I prefer this version of Sarah Connor in T1. She's this character who has to kind of figure it out as she goes because she doesn't have that much information. She hasn't been training. She hasn't done a bunch of weapon training. She's just kind of figuring it out. And you can just see those little like instances of her innocence that's still there. She hasn't been totally like ruined yet or gone kind of crazy yet. She still has that innocence, but also you can see those glimpses of her being a badass and resilient, especially at the end of the movie. But yeah, Linda Hamilton in this movie is just incredible. And of course, Arnold, who was very hesitant to take this role. He just kind of thought it was going to be another like B-level action movie that was probably going to flop. But when he saw one of the early edits of the movie, he was like, oh, damn, this we're onto something here. This could be something really interesting. It's also kind of interesting, you know, the people that they almost casted to play the Terminator, Stallone, Mel Gibson, even O.J. Simpson. And then we get that whole thing where it comes out that James Cameron didn't want to cast O.J. because, you know, he didn't think he would be that believable as a killer. in this movie. So yeah, we get that. But yeah, Arnold, he only says, I think it is like 17 lines in this movie, but a character. I mean, this is a movie that definitely helped to catapult his career. Of course, T2, that's a totally different level. But yeah, Arnold in this movie as the villain, as this bad guy with more grit. He's more unforgiving. Seeing Arnold as a bad guy in this movie is just really damn fun. And every time in this movie where we get transported into the future, I talked about this a little bit a second ago, but watching like Reese and the other resistance fighters fighting these machines, man, it just has that perfect 80s charm to the technology in this desolate world that they're in. It's just fun action all around. And it kind of gives us that glimpse of how Cameron pulled off a lot of the things in Aliens in this movie with the miniatures and other things like that. But it's just awesome and a lot of fun. And I already mentioned earlier about Cameron's attention to detail. Now, this is going to sound pretty stupid, but in this movie, I absolutely love how the lasers shoot in this movie. Just the sound that they make, the kind of repetition of them, kind of sounds like the rifles a little bit in Aliens, but it's just that small little detail that to me is just so distinct, and I love it. And of course, I have to talk about Tech Noir and that whole scene where Arnold finally finds Sarah and he's basically gonna blow her fucking head off. And then Kyle just intervenes, shoots Arnold, and then they realize, okay, this thing cannot be human. And then Reese gives us the OG, come with me if you want to live line, right? That whole thing. And yeah, I have to shout out the legend Stan Winston and his entire team behind the effects in this movie, the stop motion they have in this movie, the miniatures, the grit and the grime of all of that stuff. Love the practical effects in this movie as well. It's incredible. I mean, like that whole scene where Arnold's doing surgery on himself, to me is just really damn enjoyable, and also just gives you that great 80s charm that only an 80s movie like this can give you. I also love the entire car chase scene between Sarah, Reese, and Arnold in downtown LA for this low budget of a movie is a great chase scene. Very underrated scene in this movie, in my opinion. And yeah, maybe Arnold turning like full-blown robot at the end of the movie might have been a little ambitious for a movie in 1984 because there's some things here that don't age all that well. Yes, like I mentioned earlier, it does have, of course, a little bit of charm to it as well. But, you know, yeah, it looks a little bit ridiculous. But, you know, and they had to kind of think of a lot of different ways to pull off those scenes, like having the robot, just the top half of him on top of a person as they kind of walk, and then using stop animation, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, sometimes it looks a little silly, but still, T1, what an incredible movie. In my opinion, one of the greatest sci-fi movies ever made. So yes, of course, I agree with T1 being in the #1 spot, but thanks so much, everybody, for watching my thoughts, my reviews on how Rotten Tomatoes ranks the Terminator franchise. It's a wild ride. The Terminator franchise is pretty consistent, though. Most of these movies, and pretty much all of these movies, I can have a good time with. Of course, T1 and T2, incredible, all-time classics, but overall, still a fun franchise. Anyways, everybody, if you want some more content from me right now, go ahead and check out one of these videos next to me. If you don't want to miss future content, make sure you subscribe. That's the best way to do that. Then you'll get notified of future content. But thanks again for watching, everybody. My name is Matt, and I will talk to you in the next one.